Hello, Yasin, can you hear me?
Yes, Augustine.
So you see on the screen you have the view on the right side, right? You have the option view. Click on that one and then select gallery view.
On the right. You mean on
Yes.
top or at the bottom?
On the top, on the top.
Top right. Can you hear me?
I say yes, we can hear you.
I have not seen it. I have not seen it.
So
No.
So just on the right side, close to the participant, you have the there is the number which is counting, and then close to that you have the view, right? No? Okay, can you quickly share your screen? Just a minute. Yes. Can you just accept, approve? Yes. Can you just accept?
Theo, we see that you've switched on your video and we see the background, but we do not see you.
Yeah, I saw it now. Gallery view, yes.
No, it's fine. Do not touch it again. I already changed it. Yes, do not touch it.
That's fine.
So I think the event is now also streamed on the YouTube as well.
Hadisha.
Hello, Mawish. Hello, Faye.
Hi, Hadisha. I sent you the link.
Hello, Theo.
Hi,
By
Theo.
WhatsApp.
Madam, I've seen it. Yes, Madam.
Hi.
Mr. Guruta.
Hi, Mawish. Your screen.
Hi, Aisata. Thank you for joining in. See you.
Good.
Donc, moi, je ne touche rien. Mais je peux travailler quand même.
Yes, Honorable Minister.
Good afternoon to all of you.
Good afternoon, Honorable
Good
Minister.
afternoon, Honorable Minister. Your voice is coming in and out.
Oh, is it?
Okay, it seemed to be clear just now. Maybe try and speak again.
Okay. Is it voice okay?
I think we're good. It's okay now.
Okay.
Hello. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Khadija. We hear you.
Welcome everybody to the Economic Update launch. It's a pleasure to have all of you here. Okay, the annual, this is the annual launch of the Gambia Economic Update. The Economic Update is an annual publication that provides an update on the economic developments and challenges facing the Gambia. The launch of this report is an opportunity to have a dialogue about the current economic and structural challenges we are facing. So we are happy to see all of you here at this event. But quickly, before we start the event, we just want to take you through a few housekeeping rules. One is that everybody should have their mic off. We will only have the speakers, mic of the speakers on during the event. This is to ensure that we avoid some background noises because it's a live event and there will be a lot of people watching us live. And secondly, also, all the speakers should have on their, the background pictures. So please, speakers, keep on your background pictures on. Okay. So before we start, I just want to take all of you through the agenda for the day. We will have the welcome note from our resident rep, Faye Borough Office. Then we will have the Honorable Minister, Mambre Njai. He will give the opening remarks of the event. This will take us through to session one of the event, the macroeconomic overview. During that session, we will have the first presentation by our country economic Mehwis. She spearheaded the report, and then she will give us key findings from the report. That will take us to a panel discussion that will be moderated by Bazar Adview. He's a young professional from the bank. So he will moderate the session. And during the session, we will have Theo Davis Thomas, the practice manager. Then we will have Mamadou Diallo Bari, resident representative, IMF, Abdoulaye Diallo, permanent secretary, Ministry of Finance. This will take us through a very short question and answer session. Then we will have a virtual coffee break. After the virtual coffee break, we will have a conversation on inclusive job resilience in the Gambia. During that, we will have presentation by two people. That is Maurice Mayer, senior economist, World Bank. And then we'll have another presentation on strengthening the climate infrastructure and physical resilience by Maya Eden, assistant professor, economics department. Then we'll have the question and answer session. Closing remarks by the permanent secretary, Minister of Finance, Mr. Abdoulaye Diallo. And then the vote of thanks by Lydia, the operation manager, officer at the World Bank. And that's the agenda for the day. We hope that you will have a very interesting discussions, and we will welcome comments from everyone. For the comments, you can just, if you have any comments or questions, post them on the chat. We'll be moderating the chat during the presentations. So I'm very happy to welcome our resident rep, Faye Borough Office, to give us a welcome note. Faye, you are welcome.
Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you can hear me. I hope my internet is clear. Welcome, Honorable Minister and distinguished ladies and gentlemen. I'm very pleased to be launching our first Gambia Economic Update. We conduct periodic economic updates in the countries we work in around the world to provide an outlook for economic growth and analysis of a special topic of importance to the country. This report is titled Preserving the Gains, in recognition of the fact that before COVID, the Gambia's economy was actually doing quite well, exceeding 6% during the 2 years before the pandemic. There was rebounding confidence in the economy, increasing investment, low interest rates, and the tourism sector was booming. Unfortunately, as was the case in the rest of the world, the pandemic halted the growth of the country, with the tourism sector collapsing, food prices rising, households reporting income losses, and poverty on the rise. The effect of the school closings on learning also cannot be overstated. Fortunately, increase in official remittances, favorable rainfall, and extensive donor support for the COVID response has really helped to keep the country afloat during these hard times. And the country has weathered what we hope to be the worst of the storm, especially now with the COVID vaccines arriving in the country. We do see light at the end of the tunnel. So this report comes at an opportune time as Gambia, similar to other countries across the world, are figuring their way out of the COVID-19 crisis. The focus needs to be on preserving the gains that have been made in the country to a strong, diversified, and resilient economy. As I mentioned, in addition to the macroeconomic analysis, our economic updates typically include 1 or 2 special topics that we feel are critical to the development of the country. For this report, we have conducted analysis and proposed policy recommendations around 2 critical aspects of the Gambia's economic recovery over the medium term. So those 2 areas are jobs and resilience. First of all, in terms of jobs, it is very critical for the Gambian economy to create jobs for its people. We have labor force participation at quite low levels at 53%, with women, youth, and rural areas even more severely affected. This doesn't bode well for the future of the country, so we all agree that it will be critical to reverse this trend. Most importantly, the jobs need to be driven by the private sector, as the public sector needs its scarce resources to provide important social services such as good health, education. So the chapter on jobs, discussing potential jobs coming from the tourism and hospitality sector, as well as other potential sectors. Tourism and the extensive coastal urban area that we have in the Gambia, the economy is highly vulnerable to external shocks. Therefore, we decided to discuss the importance of strengthening the climate, infrastructure, and fiscal resilience. So a robust discussion on resilience. So these areas actually are some of the major areas that are part of our country partnership framework, which is our 5-year strategy, which is currently under preparation. So if you've not yet had an opportunity, please do visit our website, worldbank.org/Gambia, very easy to remember, worldbank.org/Gambia, to provide your inputs on what we call the CPF as we are preparing it. And we do want to hear from everyone in terms of the areas of focus. So as noted by Hadija, we have a presentation on the findings of the report by the country economist, followed by a panel and some additional presentations on the subtopics. So I hope this session and the report will help the Gambia design sustainable, inclusive, and green economic policies that will galvanize the country and put it on the path to job creation and economic transformation. I look forward to a great discussion on this platform and all the social media channels. Once more, thank you for joining us. We really appreciate your participation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Faye, for giving us a very good summary of the report. Thank you very much for that. We now welcome the Honorable Minister, Mr. Mambrenjai, to give the welcome remarks.
Thank you, guys. Thank you. The resident representative World Bank, the practice manager World Bank, the resident representative IMF, UNDP, the permanent secretary minister of finance, senior government officials, resident representative of all development partners, panelists, civil society organizations, members of the media present, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, all protocols respectfully observed. Good afternoon to you all. It is my pleasure to welcome you all to the launch of this timely and essential update on our economy, as it provides the backdrop and sets the pace for the direction of our economic policy over short and medium term. Before we commence, I would like to use this opportunity to register my sincere gratitude to the World Bank team, who undoubtedly dedicated a significant amount of time and efforts towards producing this comprehensive, yes, succinct report on the Gambia's economy. My ministry counts on the continued support of the team to implement reforms based on the findings of this report. I cannot stress enough the importance of accurate and timely data to aid in policy formulation. This year, more than any other, it is all the more important as 2020 was an unusual year with highly unprecedented challenges in most sectors of our economy and a lot of uncertainty still surrounding us. This means that we cannot only rely on historical data, but also on recent data to understand the needs of economic policy planning and formulation. This is fundamental today as policies for structural reforms to fast-track economic recovery and building resilience is required more than ever. This report fulfills the needs during this rather uncertain period through its comprehensive review of our fiscal policy and recent economic developments, our economic outlook and the challenges ahead of us, useful policy recommendations to spur growth and progress on path to recovery, and most importantly, building resilience for our economy to withstand future shocks with the aim of preserving macroeconomic stability. As the theme of this economic update goes, we must be in a position to preserve the gains which can only be achieved with knowledge derived from timely and relevant data. As we are all aware, sectors of the economy, especially tourism and agriculture, went through turbulent periods over the past years as a result of COVID-19 pandemic and effects of. With these two sectors being of growth and employment has suffered impacts with negative effects on our population. While considerable efforts have been made by government to ensure that these sectors remain resilient against these shocks, we believe for their take on board the recommendations set out in the report to enable us to achieve goals. It is government's utmost to improve the lives and livelihoods of Gambians, which would be made easier if they are economically empowered. The idea of a more inclusive job agenda is unquestionably shared aspirations as giving us the opportunity to live decent and dignified lives remains one of our key priorities. In the same vein, we have a window of opportunity to harness our demographic dividend, which will play a huge role in strengthening resilience along other crucial measures. Work is already underway for the development of a national demographic dividend profile, which, when completed, will set the framework for policies to have a pivotal moment of our economy. Although the prospect for 2021 looks relatively positive, we are still on a shaky path to recovery. We will therefore work tirelessly to ensure that the recommendations from this report are implemented with utmost dedication to reach our desired goal for our economy. With that said, I hereby renew government's commitment to our shared ambition for a growing, resilient, and stable economy. I look forward to insightful and fruitful discussions in the agenda. I thank you all for your kind attention.
Thank you, Honorable Minister. for that wonderful statement. He just reminded us that we have a lot of games to harness. So this will take us now to the next part of the agenda, where we'll have a presentation by Mehwis. The theme of the session is the macroeconomic overview, a conversation. This will be headed by our country economist, Mehwis Ashraf. She will present the findings of the report. Mehwis, welcome.
Thank you, Hatija. Good afternoon, Honorable Minister, dignitaries, development partners, government officials, participants from other walks of life, colleagues and friends. It's a pleasure to have you here. I will walk you through the presentation that we have prepared on the first part of the report. Let me share my screen. Just a second. Azumi, can you put my presentation because I can't seem to share my screen? So as I mentioned, I will be walking you through the first part of the report, which is talking about the macroeconomic update. My talk would comprise of 3 sections. The first section is about recent developments in which we are looking back at 2019, which was a pre-COVID time, and also the first half of 2020, which was the data available when we produced the report, which is also the COVID times. Then I will also walk you through the second section, which is about our assessment of the macroeconomic outlook for the Gambia and the challenges that need to be addressed through structural reforms. If I go to the first section and I talk about the 2019, we do see that the GDP growth was strong, above 6% in 2019, driven by investment in private consumption and mirrored by services and construction sectors on the supply side. However, we do notice that the growth comes with imbalances, at least on the external side. We saw that the consumption investment, Azumi, can you please? Yeah, thank you. So we see that the consumption investment growth was reflected in the growth of merchandise imports, while merchandise exports also recovered. Still trade deficit was the largest ever. However, remittances were a record high and official transfers increased by almost 3 times the level in 2018. As a result, we see that the current account deficit improved considerably in 2019. On the fiscal side of the things, the deficit was financed through a combination of capital and FDI inflows that boosted foreign exchange reserves and contributed to a stable exchange rate. When we go to the fiscal side of the things, we do see that the fiscal deficit was the lowest ever that we have seen in a decade's time since 2009. And that achievement is despite increased expenditures as revenue and grants improved both on the taxes side and non-taxes side, and budget support grants were substantial. Azumi, can you please move the slides? The next slide, please. As a result of the improvement in both the fiscal and the current account deficit, public debt in terms of GDP declined to 80% in 2019. We also see on the headline inflation side that it increased, but the core inflation remained subdued, which allowed the Central Bank of the Gambia to go for monetary easing. We also see the private sector credit growth was strong for 2019, especially in distributive trade, construction, and tourism sectors, which are the key drivers of economic growth in the Gambia. As Faye also mentioned, before COVID-19, we saw, as per the international poverty rate, that poverty rates in the Gambia have been declining, and the rising economic activity has been a single most factor. But however, there are a lot of differences when we see the progress on a geographical basis. Living conditions differ dramatically throughout the country, and high levels of rural to urban migration do contribute to a lot of concentration of poverty around urban areas. If we go now to the first half of 2020, which is also the period that the report covered, in which the COVID hit the country, we did see that the growth drivers shifted away from tourism sector as tourism came to a halt due to the containment measures and travel restrictions put in place to combat the COVID-19 crisis and pandemic. But remittance inflows continue breaking record, which fueled private construction. On the agriculture side of the things, the favorable rainfall that was received by the country last year, good access to inputs and few pest outbreaks did result in strong recovery on the agriculture sector and good crops production for the real sector there. And on the external side, we did see that the current account deficit worsened for the first half of 2020 as COVID-19 took its toll on tourism, impacting services balances, and FDI also declined. But remittances and donor assistance came to rescue and boosted foreign reserves and contributed to a stable currency despite the lockdown and the crisis. But on the fiscal side, we see that fiscal accounts did exhibit pressure, and rightly so, to accommodate emergency and priority social spending. Surprisingly enough, we did see that the tax revenue collection showed resilience in the face of the shocks, while one-off items boosted non-tax revenue. On the external side of the support, we did see that the donor and budget grant support also supported the Gambia's the government's expanded recurrent spending, but we see that the capital expenditure lacked as project execution slowed down due to lockdowns and the containment measures that were put in place. But this is a snapshot of the fiscal account on the first half of 2020. We also note that the SOEs, the transfers to SOEs continue to feature prominently in recurrent spending. As per the information that was available to us, we did estimate the different channels through which the SOEs are inflicting a cost on the fiscal accounts on the government budget, and we have come up with a number which is around 6% of 2019 GDP, which is quite huge in the context of the Gambia, and calls for a more expedited and concerted effort to move forward with the SOE reform agenda. Public debt continued to decline, but we do expect a small increase in the public debt in percent of GDP at the year end. However, we do see that the short-term domestic debt is still around 60% of total domestic debt, which poses refinancing and repricing risks. Let me commend the government here that they have come up with an annual borrowing plan communicating to the market their intention to lengthen the maturity profile of the domestic debt. We saw that publication earlier this month for the rest of the year, and we do believe that that would go a long way in terms of improving these risks that we are highlighting in the report. On the inflation side, as domestic demand plummeted due to lockdowns and dismal economic activity, we see that the headline inflation declined, and that helped the Central Bank of the Gambia to conduct an expansionary monetary stance. As one could have imagined, because of the dismal economic activity, private sector credit growth stagnated compared to end 2019, but construction sector fueled by remittances did show a promise. On the poverty side, we are estimating that it's likely to have increased, wiping off some of the gains that have been achieved pre-COVID. As per the high frequency survey, the first wave that was conducted by the Gambia Bureau of Statistics in consultation with the World Bank, we see that 9 out of 10 households are experiencing a decline in total income between mid-March and August 2020, mostly from agriculture, non-farm businesses, and private transfers. That makes me conclude the section on the recent developments. Now, what's ahead for the Gambia, and how do we see the economic outlook for the Gambia, and what are the challenges that need to be addressed? So we do see, and we estimate that the GDP growth will be stagnated in 2020, meaning there will be no growth, 0% growth, but we do expect a gradual recovery in 2021, which would be conditional upon global economic recovery, political stability, and normal weather conditions. We also expect inflation to decline towards the central bank's target of 5% over the medium term. On the external side, we do expect that the current account deficit is projected to stay high over the medium term, reflecting the high import content of the public investment projects that the government plans to undertake. But we expect the project grants and private FDI flows to be the key external financing sources to cover that deficit. Our fiscal deficit is also expected to rise at least for 2021, as the budget 2021 shows as well, as the government responds to challenges caused by the pandemic and attempts to restart the economy. But we also expect that this deficit will decline over the medium term, and the government would converge to a primary surplus in line with its medium-term fiscal framework. That would help reduce the public debt to GDP ratio and allow maintaining debt sustainability over the medium to long term. This is a table of the key macroeconomic indicators that I was talking about. As you could see, we are expecting a little higher than 3% of real GDP growth for 2021 and a more pronounced recovery for 2022. Since this report was prepared for in December, where we had the information for the first half of 2020, there have been some latest data that we wanted to share with you in this launch. I'm happy to report that this data is showing the direction that we had taken in the report. It's just that there are some numbers out that we wanted to share with you. Tourist arrivals did decline by 64% overall for 2020. Remittance flows grew by 80%. Annual inflation declined by 5.9%. Tax collection, surprisingly and interestingly, reached 95% of the pre-COVID-19 target, and I'm not talking about the revised target. Fiscal deficit is estimated to have reduced to 1.9% of GDP, which is commendable. As per the preliminary external accounts data that's available, we see that reserves are above 5 months of next year's imports of goods and services. The outlook that I just mentioned to you in terms of 2021 and 2022, we do see some risks to the outlook, both on the internal side and external side. Expansive fiscal policy, as laid out in the budget 2021, with the aim to kickstart the economy, needs to be very prudent. Otherwise, we risk disrupting the fiscal outlook. Connected to that is the shocks from SOEs that keep coming on to the government and are being absorbed by the government budget. We also see political risks in the wake of upcoming presidential elections that may impact the overall macro assessment or outlook that we see from our side. On the external side of the things, as we all know, the depth and duration of the pandemic, the various mutations that are happening across, the slower than anticipated vaccination drive across key tourist markets for the Gambia. And I'm happy to hear that Gambia is also going through the drive right now. But then there have been repeated lockdowns in UK, Europe, which are the key tourist markets for the Gambia. So we do see the risk coming from that, and there is uncertainty about it. So that's a risk factor for us. Weather, as we all know, has been an important determinant on the agricultural production. So we do see that as a risk factor as well. And donor support in the context of the upcoming elections, as Gambia relies heavily on external donor support. And if there are any disruptions to the political dispensation, that can also count as a risk factor. So these are the risks that we see, but we do see that for the upcoming challenges or for the challenges that we have highlighted here, the government would need to conduct structural reforms. And I would like to take the cue from the Honorable Minister, who mentioned that they are committed to do so. We're very happy to hear that. And we do believe that these reforms are needed to ensure macroeconomic stability, and they come in 5 big buckets. The first one is about improving spending efficiency and increasing tax revenues, both on the administration side and the policy front, strengthening public financial management and SOE governance, improving service delivery for crucial infrastructure such as energy, water, telecommunications. Promoting jobs is important and will require productivity increases, which will be aided by these infrastructure improvements. However, we do believe that structural economic transformation is also necessary to unlock the potential that the Gambia offers. I would like to leave you with that thought. Thank you very much for listening me out. Back to you, Hatija.
Thank you very much, Mehwis, for presenting that report. Thank you for doing a great job, Anoi. It was a pleasure to hear you going through everything. And now we move on to the next session, which is going to be a panel discussion. The panel discussion will be moderated by Bezat Adriu, a young professional from the World Bank. And the panelists, we will have Theo David Thomas, the practice manager, the global practice for macroeconomic trade investment. And we'll have Mamadou Diallo Bari, President Representative, IMF, and Abdoulaye Diallo, the Permanent Secretary, Ministry of Finance, Economic Affairs. Bezat, over to you.
Thank you very much, Hatija, and thank you, Mewish, for such an insightful presentation. Hello, everyone. Welcome also from my side. My pleasure to be here with you today and to moderate the discussion with such an esteemed panel. So let's jump right into it. First question for you, Theo. One takeaway I see from Mewish's presentation is that the Gambia's economy was affected strongly by COVID, but if we compare it to other countries, it wasn't as bad in some cases. So what do you think has helped the Gambia's economy to weather the COVID-19 crisis well relative to its peers?
Thank you very much, Besart. And firstly, thank you very much for the time to speak, Honourable Minister, members of the press, and others in the esteemed panel. So again, all protocols respectfully observed. So thank you very much for the question. Yeah, I mean, it does seem rather strange that the Gambia was not as affected as in some other countries in the region or globally by COVID. There are some structural factors that I would like to point out, and some come from the fact that the Gambia is less integrated into many global value chains in goods markets. So there were less connections to the global demand shock. Also, because of the low level of industrial and manufacturing sector, that again comes to this issue of the integration in global supply chains. So it's less interrupted by the volatility from other countries. And then also from the low value addition and seasonality of tourism. So these all help to mitigate some of the shocks. There are also some cyclical factors that I'd like to highlight. So last year, there were good weather conditions in the Gambia. And that enabled the very young labor force that we have to move between what they would have been doing in the tourism sector, perhaps, into the supporting the agricultural sector. So there was a good harvest, both of foodstuffs and of groundnuts as well. There was also, as Maywish mentioned in her presentation, very strong support from the diaspora. So remittances, some of which may have previously come through informal channels, came through to the formal sector. And we saw a very big increase, which helped not only the construction sector, but it helped to boost foreign exchange reserves as well. So that formalization, I think, was a good movement. And the support from the diaspora reflects one of the advantages that the Gambia has. Thirdly, the government's decisive and timely containment and relief measures. So we see that in many countries, supporting social sectors, the health sector, as well as trying to support small businesses as well. So I think that helped, although there's not a lot of fiscal space in the Gambia to do that. So it is quite constrained. Lastly, the sound macroeconomic management. The Gambia, the relief package, that you had a supplementary budget, so it was done in a very orderly process. It reduced some of the non-priority expenditure, allowed some expenditure switching between items to focus on those that were really combating the crisis last year. So that I think worked very well. And then in addition, I would point out the support from the development partners that you had. So a lot of people stepped up to support Gambia, and as we have done in many countries through a very difficult period. Having said all that, I still would like to point out that we see a flattening of economic growth. So it's not that the Gambia wasn't affected, it has stalled the Gambia's growth, and particularly on per capita terms, we've seen per capita incomes and extreme poverty rising. So that's something that will continue to be a focus this year and with the scarring over the medium term. And it's the same in Gambia as in many countries across the globe. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Theo. It's very insightful. Before we move on, just a quick note, you can start pouring in your questions into the chat box, so I won't be the only one asking the questions in this session, and we'll read them out after the first round of questions from my side. So let's move on a bit to the external sector. We know that the Gambia is a small open economy, and the external sector is very important. So next question for Mamadou. How would you assess the sustainability of the Gambia's external account, given that grant inflows and remittances are volatile sources of funding?
Thank you, Besat. Good evening, Honorable Minister Faye and dear participants. Thank you, Mavis, for this excellent presentation and also for inviting me to be part of this discussion. On your question, I will say the balance of payment of Gambia, as described by Mavis, is a typical balance of payment for countries that are at the lower stage of their development, characterized by a very narrow export base, but also a lot of demand for import, both for consumption good and also for equipment. So that leads to having a fiscal, a current account deficit that is usually financed through foreign aid or capital, private capital inflows in the form of remittances of foreign investment. Now, how to ensure that the balance of payment is sustainable is while expanding the export base, you have to make sure that those inflows are sustained. And for foreign aid, as you know, it's often function of the quality of reform that have been conducted in the country. And they have seen with the new dispensation, with all the reform being conducted on the transitional justice front, but also on the economic front that have led to the approval of the IMF program last year, have helped boost the budget support that Gambia have been receiving so far. In comparison, you can see 2016, the level of budget support was 0. And in 2020, Gambia received more than 90 million US dollars in budget support grant. So it shows the quality of reform will bring foreign aid in a big manner. And having a program also is a signal of commitment to reform and commitment to good economic management. So in a sense, it's helped leverage more funding for the country. Now, regarding the capital, private capital inflows, including the remittances, apart from the part of the remittances that come to support the family members in the country, beneficiary countries, these inflows tend to take into advantage of the opportunities offered by the beneficiary country. So the economic situation, as pointed out by Marish during her presentation, the business environment and also the political environment will impact those inflows. So in that sense, ensuring that policies are in place to maintain stable macroeconomic situation and support growth in place will be very important. And also policies that will help develop private sector engagement in the country will be important in terms of business environment, quality infrastructure, and a efficient and a good tax and procurement system. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mamadou. That's a lot of great food for thought. So having discussed now the external sector, let's move a bit more to fiscal policy. I believe P.S. Jallu is here with us. So question for you would be, what were the challenges on the fiscal side of things that the government had to tackle to stay the course while also responding to the needs raised by the pandemic? And what do you think were the silver linings that kept the fiscal deficit relatively in check for 2020?
Thank you very much. This is Abdullah Jallo, Permanent Secretary, Minister of Finance. In 2020, during the midst of the pandemic, what the government actually did was to improve the fiscal position of the country was to repurpose most of the non-essential services to address or support the COVID-19 emergency health expenditures. But one of the main pressure points that came as a result of the pandemic was addressed through a supplementary appropriation bill. And the bill seeks to provide relief to local government authorities, also to address the challenges in the tourism sector. In the tourism sector, the government actually provided about $100 million. There were also an urgent need to provide the relevant assistance to the media. And also because of the social inequalities inherent in the country, there was need to provide to a large extent a food distribution assistance to members of the country, members of the poor population in particular. And also there were a lot of Gambian diplomats who were overseas, and they were supposed to be Gambian diplomats who should be redeployed into the country. But because of the travel restrictions, government have to come up with additional resources to ensure that these diplomats are repatriated back to the country. Bailouts was also provided to some of our public enterprises that were linked to the travel industry. And a sum of about $91 million was given to ensure that at least at the minimum, the 3 months salaries of these institutions are met. But most importantly, government decided to scale up domestically financed investments to nearly $1 billion, just to enable just to ensure that the economic recovery path is not affected, because this amount of resources was required to stimulate the level of economic activities. And finally, it was felt necessary to ensure accountability and transparency that government established a procurement committee to manage all contracts and to ensure that all COVID-related expenditures are audited in future. And as we speak now, for your information, I was informed that before the end of March, the audited statements of the COVID-19 related activities will be presented to the National Assembly for audit purpose. But the good news was that despite all these fiscal pressures that we encountered in 2020, I would want to register that we had a tremendous amount of support from our development partners, mainly the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, the African Development Bank, and the European Union. The G20 also provided some level of debt relief. That is called the debt service suspension initiatives. And that has really helped to ease the pressure on domestic financing. Yes, on this note, and also most importantly, as has been presented by Mavis, our domestic resource mobilization really surprised us that we were able to collect about 90% of the pre-COVID-19 budget for revenues. On this note, I would want to leave it for here for the time being.
Thank you so much, P.S. Jallo. I think that gives a very good overview now on what has happened so far this year and in the past. So let's turn a bit now more to the future. In this sense, I'd like to ask Mamadou, we know that the COVID year has been very tough and it was not as bad as we had maybe expected or as bad as some other countries has had it, but of course there was negative growth in GDP per capita, and as Faye and others also mentioned, poverty increased. So there will be a need for a strong recovery. How do you see the Gambia's recovery in the short and medium term? If you could just tell us in few words. Thank you.
Thank you, Basat. I just want to take this opportunity to inform that next week we'll start conducting the second review of the IMF program in the Gambia. So that will give us the opportunity to do a thorough analysis of the economic performance of 2020 and early 2021 that will inform our view of the outlook. But for now, what we see a positive outlook in 2021 and going forward in the assumption that tourism will progressively recover as the COVID-19 vaccine rollout continue and the travel restriction are lifted, particularly in Europe, where most of the tourists visiting Gambia come from. We also think it will be positive based on the stimulus package that is included in the 2021 budget. The implementation of that stimulus package will help sustain support growth. In the medium term, we have also the OIC, the organization of the OIC Summit in 2022 that involves also a lot of infrastructure projects. There is the modernization of the agricultural sector to make it more climate resilient with a lot of partners helping the government in that regard. We have, in addition, all the projects that is ongoing that the World Bank and other partners is supporting in the energy sector that we hope the friction will help support the medium-term growth going forward. There are risks, I will not repeat them. Mavish already mentioned them during her presentation. So the risk exists, so we need to do a deep analysis in order to know what will be the shape of recovery going forward. But the outlook is positive. Thank you.
Thank you, Mamadou. That's really, really helpful. So this recovery that we are hoping for, certainly it will require macro fiscal stability and prudent fiscal policies, but it will also require investing in the future of the economy. So this is a tough balance. So question for the government, Pietrallo, how does the government plan to maintain macro fiscal stability while also investing in physical capital through infrastructure, but also human capital through education and health, which will be necessary to unlock the potential of the economy? If you could tell us just in few words in the interest of time. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. I'll be very quick on this because of time. The IMF noticed that this will be an issue this year, and they have decided to provide an ECF augmentation of 20 million SDR, and we have just received that in February of this year. We also plan to improve on the tax administration, mainly to rationalize tax expenditures and promote the use of electronic tax payments. We also want to explore, that is the extension of the G20 debt service support suspension initiative. We'll focus also a lot more on limited concessional external financing. We profile our domestic debt, continue the rationalization of diplomatic missions. We have now virtually closed down Algeria mission. We'll continue to ensure that all projects that will be externally financed mainly by grants or limited concessional financing. We'll also explore other PPP options and try and contain the contingent liabilities emanating from state-owned enterprises. With these measures, it will help us to scale up both social and economic infrastructure. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Pietrallo. So last question from my side before opening the floor. Theo, we hear a lot about building back better, and the World Bank certainly likes to discuss the concept of building back better. How do you think the Gambia specifically can build back better?
Thank you very much, Basat. And I think this response builds on what the Permanent Secretary just said, which is a lot of the fundamental reforms that the Gambia is doing. So Build Back Better is really looking at the medium to long term, how the transition of the economy has to cope with changing circumstances. I just want to pull out one quote from the report, and that's that climate risk is a macroeconomic risk. And that's very true for countries like the Gambia. So, one of the first things that the report draws out, and I would recommend, is improving climate resilience to better respond to weather and other climatic related shocks. And for the Gambia, that's mostly adaptation. So things like agricultural irrigation services, coastal erosion, road standards or zoning. And there are lots of interesting examples, and some which will cost money, but many others which will have a benefit all of their own in terms of improving standards. The other is, I think, a shift that many countries are doing to focus on environmental sustainability, particularly given the country's geographic location. And it's something that the Gambia can actually build on very positively as part of its tourism offer and build on. And that comes to a third point, which is really trying to diversify the tourism offer in the market, trying to attract different types of tourism, different segments in the market. And Gambia has a lot to offer in that sense, but it has to be a conducive investment location, both for investors within the region and for elsewhere. And then a fourth point, I think, building back better is really getting to promote the dynamism of the economy. And I think that will come from small businesses, small industrial establishments in the country that can tap into both the local and the regional value chains, as well as looking further afield. And there are some very interesting dynamic companies in the region that are looking at doing things like horticulture, aquaculture, etc., and really taking advantage of global supply chains. And then just the last point, an area that we've worked a lot on is digital transformation. And I can't emphasize how much this crisis has really highlighted the importance to countries at every level of economic development in terms of the importance of digital development in bringing the people together, in terms of giving them opportunities across the country. So digital development, I think, is going to be important across the board. And then lastly, a more sort of medium-term agenda for building back better would be creating a skilled workforce, and particularly focusing on women and girls, making sure they stay in school, reducing any of the scarring that we often see when we have periods, crises like this. What we've seen is a lot of women, a lot of young girls have exited schools, and many don't return. So I think a big effort to try and make sure that young girls return to school, and a focus initially on schooling, but then over time on lifelong learning, which is becoming increasingly important for adaptable labor force. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Theo. So I'll turn now to the questions from the chat. And our first question is again for you, from Aisata De, on the Gambia's resilience. So you had mentioned in the beginning that the Gambia showed some degree of resilience to COVID, and some of that was because of unexpected factors, such as the diaspora stepping up and doing its part much more than we had hoped for, and also the rain that was much more favorable this year. But the question is then, how long do you think the Gambia can maintain this resilience, taking into account the multiple COVID waves?
So was that to me, Besart, or to?
Yes, Theo, to you.
Okay, thank you very much. I mean, there are multiple factors here. I think obviously that the Gambia will have to cope with the exogenous shocks that are coming, and we see multiple countries in the region that have some have deeper shocks, like Cape Verde on its tourism sector. It has double-digit declines in growth last year. So I think the Gambia is in a reasonably strong position. We would hope to see the countries where a lot of the diaspora are sending resources from pick up slightly sooner. The vaccine programs are rolling out around the world. So I think that does give a sign for optimism. So some of those structural factors, some are obviously outside the control in terms of weather conditions and things like that. But I do think that because of the Gambia's prudent macroeconomic management over this last 18 months or so, it's in a reasonably strong position to cope with future shocks. It hasn't got a lot of fiscal space. So I think, as the permanent secretary mentioned, if there were to be another or a more prolonged shock, then we would have to work with the government to look at both perhaps another supplemental budget to make sure that the resources are going to sustain both households and businesses for a more prolonged period, but then also look to reorientate some of the investments to areas that can boost demand, as well as looking again to donors, development partners, to help them through a more prolonged period. I mean, I do hope we don't come to that, but I think the fundamental in all of this is maintaining strong, prudent macroeconomic management, and as part of that, the improved transparency over things like state-owned enterprises, the government's budget, etc. Thank you.
Thank you, Theo. This next question is for Mamadou by Wojciech from the EU delegation. It says, remittances play a very important role, but appear to be mainly fueling the construction sector. In your view, would its reallocation to investment in other sectors be favorable? And if so, what kind of policies could support it?
Thank you, Basat, and thank you for the question. As I said, in my first statement, is that remittances are looking for opportunities to invest. You come to the Gambia, what you see first is real estate. It's a sector that is developing well, so you see people going to that sector. So in order to diversifying is always very good, but you need policies to make sure that that diversification happens. And in that regard, improving the utility companies, energy, having reliable energy in order to be able to transform, to bring agriculture beyond just producing fruit. To transform it, you need a reliable energy sector. So the reform of the energy sector and making sure that there is efficient, really run energy company is very important. So that's one factor. You have another factor that is promising worldwide is the telecommunication sector with all this digitalization, which requires strong reform. I think World Bank is supporting the authorities in order to push reform in that sector. So making sure that you have a telecommunications sector that is liberalized, where access to new investors are possible, I think is a big area where an investor can also be looking at. And then you have the tourism sector that is already a very dynamic sector in the Gambia. I think it's true that the shock of the pandemic is there, but we have to start thinking of what we can do in that sector to make it more permanent through-year tourism, season in the Gambia, not only a tourist that is seasonal. So I think investing in that area also is very important. So there is a business environment is always good. Maintaining macroeconomic stability, that is the basis for everything. And then make sure that the infrastructure, road, the extension of the port also is very important in ensuring that the trade is functioning well. The trade is 1/3 of the economy in the Gambia. So I think the development of the port will bring a lot of efficiency in the economy, which will give other opportunities for investment for these remittances. So that's what I have to say.
Thank you, Mamadou. I think we have time for one last question from the chat, which goes to PS Jallo from Stefan Mert from the European Union delegation. The main challenge regarding tourism is to reduce the over-reliance on international tour operators. which is what makes Gambian tourism so seasonal, with jobs destroyed every 6 months. Tour operators are on the decline everywhere. So will the Gambia be able to change this model before more of them crash, and have lessons from the Thomas Cook bankruptcy been learned? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think the Thomas Cook lesson and the outbreak of the Ebola crisis has really demonstrated that our tourism sector has been very resilient over the years, and it's one of the most resilient in industry or sector. However, we also recognize that there is a need to diversify within this industry. And we have even started engaging with, as a government, to ensure that we promote private sector participation also in the rural areas. This will, and now our plan is to make sure that we promote not only beach tourism, but also tourism relating to bird watching and also even animals. There are plans to develop a national park in the Lower River region. And we believe that if that is very, very successful, it will really help to change the dynamics so that we don't depend too much on the beach tourism, if I would say. I also believe that if we enhance or promote river transport, it will really be a game changer as far as tourism is concerned. And also, we need to look at other options or markets apart from besides the advanced countries, and see how we can promote even local tourism that would be more resilient and sustainable. And also we can promote regional tourism, where we have noticed that we are getting a lot of arrivals also from our regions like Nigeria. I believe that with expanding the markets to our region and promoting a lot of internal tourism will help to make this sector resilient. Thank you.
Thank you, P.S. Jallo. Very insightful. We did receive one more comment from UNICEF that I'd like to read out. It says, COVID-19 exacerbated structural problems that were already present before the pandemic. In the education sector, albeit good access indicators at the primary level, foundational literacy and numeracy is low, highlighting that the challenge is not necessarily access, but rather poor learning. Improving human capital will be critical for the country to achieve desired economic transformation. So just on that, I'd like to say that we fully support this view. We agree. It's something that the report stresses and that Faye also mentioned in the beginning. So we're fully on board with this comment. Thank you very much. At this point, I'd like to ask if there are any other questions before we close the panel discussion. Okay, I don't see any hands raised here in the Zoom meeting or any other comments coming in. So thank you very much, everyone, for your participation. I very much enjoyed the discussion. I think it was very productive, and I hope that the viewers also found it useful. Hatija, over to you.
Thank you, everyone. This was a very interesting discussion, and your comments were very, very good. Thank you all. We'll just have a short break for now, just for 5 minutes, and then we will come back soon. Okay. Thank you, everyone, and welcome back to the second session of the day. For this session, we will have a presentation this session is a conversation on inclusion, inclusive jobs, resilience in the Gambia. I see that a lot of comments online are on the job creation and everything. So it will be interesting to hear what Maurice, our senior economics, will have to say. He will be doing the first presentation. And then the second presentation will be strengthening the climate, infrastructure, and physical resilience. That will be done by Maya Eden, the Assistant Professor, Economics Department and International from the International Business School, Brandeis University. This will be followed by a short question and answer session. So you can start posting your questions right now in the chat box. So I will hand it over to Maurice to do the presentation.
Thanks so much, Hadija, for giving me the floor. I can't share my presentation. It has to be someone in your team. So I'm waiting for the presentation to come online.
Sorry about that, Maurice. Just give us a minute.
That sounds good. I think we are getting there. Looks good. Thank you very much. Honorable Minister, the audience, it is my pleasure to present key findings from the special topic of the economic update, which focuses on labor markets and inclusive economic growth. Next slide. Why do we care about labor markets? Well, because labor income is the single most important source of income. Independent of continent and development status of countries, labor markets contribute substantially to welfare improvements of households and play a fundamental role in reducing poverty. For this presentation, I would like to focus on the inclusivity of labor markets and highlight how labor market outcomes differ across regions, people, and jobs. In addition, I would like to describe some challenges and constraints, and then I'd outline a policy agenda for more inclusive jobs. First, let me describe how people are included into the labor market in the Gambia. The Gambia was projected to have a total population of 2.3 million people in 2020. Around 1.3 million are between 15 and 64 and are part of the working age population. Labor market outcomes show large variation across two dimensions. First, labor force participation, whereby 53% of the working age population is available to work. Note that labor force participation among women is only 43% compared to 64% among men. Second, the unemployment rate, which is 35%. This share is much higher in rural areas, around 52%, where many farmers produce for own consumption, but not for sale in markets. Also, the youth unemployment rate is 42%. These two statistics suggest that the Gambia is not making use of its full potential and misses out on talents, with a negative impact on economic growth, household incomes, and poverty reduction. Next slide, please. Next, I will describe a short overview on jobs, both in terms of sector and status. In urban areas, 83% of jobs are in the service sector, which also contributed to high vulnerability during COVID-19. In rural areas, many jobs in the agricultural sector with a high degree of seasonality. Yet, also in rural areas, the share of jobs in the service sector has been growing quickly. Our analysis shows that a large share of jobs is informal, and more than half work as self-employed or own account workers. Due to the absence of a universal social safety net, this contributes to lack of protection when shocks hit the country. Next slide. As we think about challenges and constraints, we do see that low incomes from labor markets reflect low productivity, lack of education and experience, and sluggish job creation. Around 17% earn less than 2,000 Gambian dollars per month. There is significant variation across sectors and regions. For instance, incomes from agriculture in rural and remote areas are low, and jobs in finance and information technology, often in urban areas, are well paid. These low wages reflect low productivity due to lack of education and firm or sector-specific experience. Here it is worrisome to see that the Gambia ranks 137 out of 174 countries for the Human Capital Index. And finally, sluggish job creation undermines the inclusion in a country where each year around 60,000 men and women enter the labor force. For each of these outcomes, we again observe that households in rural areas and those with low levels of education fall behind. Next slide, please. In the context of these challenges and constraints, labor markets are changing quickly with a profound impact on inclusion. In the short term, we have already seen how COVID-19 has disrupted the service sector and especially tourism. In the medium and long term, digitalization, urbanization, and climate change are expected to change job profiles. In addition, population growth is expected to remain high. In the Gambia, this reallocation of labor within and across sectors, but also across space, has already started. High levels of internal and external migration and a shift towards the service sector are likely to continue. This will further contribute to a transformation of labor markets. The country should build on these opportunities and accelerate an economic transformation which is likely to increase productivity, increase wages, and create new jobs. This transformation also bears the potential to strengthen inclusion independent of place of residence, gender, and age. Next slide, please. Finally, a policy agenda which can support this transformation of labor markets. This would include interventions along 4 dimensions. First, invest in people by supporting the accumulation of human capital. Second, facilitate job creation by improving the business environment, which is a precondition for private sector-led growth. Third, upgrade job quality and earnings by supporting formalization and facilitating access to markets, especially in rural areas. And fourth, raise female labor force participation by offering, for example, grants for female entrepreneurship. Each of these interventions support a resilient recovery and help the country in unlocking its true potential for all men and women in rural and urban areas and independent of age. Thank you very much for this opportunity, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Maurice, for that brilliant presentation. While we prepare for the next presentation, if you have any questions, you can post them in the chat room. They will be read to the presenters later. Please do that. We have now we are moving on to our next presentation. That's going to be done by Maya. She's an economist from the our next presentation is by Maya Eden, an assistant professor, economics department and international business school, Brandeis University. Maya, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And thank you, Honorable Minister and audience. It's a pleasure to present in front of you. Next slide, please. I didn't realize that I wouldn't be controlling my own slides, so sorry about that. Okay, so we meet today during difficult times. With the coronavirus raging and people's livelihoods collapsing, it can be hard to think about anything else beyond immediate crisis response. But we believe that this would be a mistake. As Winston Churchill said, never let a good crisis go to waste. One advantage of crises of this scale is that they expose the system's vulnerabilities. Taking note of where the system fell short during the current crisis provides invaluable guidance for how to build back a more resilient future. Let's go to the next slide. Thank you. How can we build a more resilient future? In this report, we propose a three-tiered strategy. The first is to identify likely risks. For the Gambia, there are several types of shocks that occur with some regularity. One is public health crises. While the global scale of the current pandemic is virtually unprecedented, outbreaks that jeopardize public health occur with some regularity. Just a few years ago, the region suffered from an Ebola outbreak, which could have potentially affected the Gambia. Another important source of risk is climate. The Gambia's economy is concentrated in two sectors which are vulnerable to climate risk: agriculture and tourism. The agricultural sector is very dependent on rainfall, which makes it vulnerable to droughts. Given the variability of the country's rainfall, we calculate that roughly once in every 8 years, there will be a severe enough drought that reduces crop production by at least 15%. Because of the economy's reliance on agriculture, this will cause a drop in GDP of over 3.5%. Just to reiterate what was been said, in the Gambia, macroeconomic risk, climate risk is macroeconomic risk. The tourism sector is primarily concentrated along the coast, which makes it vulnerable to coastal flooding. Estimates suggest that average annual loss from floods is around 0.2% of GDP. However, because of the country's erratic rainfall, this average masks substantial variation. In some years, there may be no flood damage at all, while in other years, damage may be substantial. For example, just this year in September 2020, flooding, windstorms, and fires affected over 50,000 people and caused substantial damage both to public and to private properties. The second tier of our proposed strategy is about preparing for these known risks. Resilient infrastructure is vital for the continual provision of basic services during crisis. In the current crisis, digital infrastructure continues to play an important role in providing people with timely information and coordinating policy efforts. It should be expanded and strengthened. In the short term, digitalization of government processes can reduce the need for in-person interactions. In addition, improvements to existing digital financial services would allow for an expansion in online commerce. In the long term, the country should take steps to make internet usage more affordable. During the current pandemic, countries with higher internet penetration were able to transition into remote work and remote learning for students. However, in the Gambia, these coping strategies were basically unavailable, as internet penetration is only at 20%. Liberalizing the backbone infrastructure and reforming the telecom SOEs may reduce costs, which would allow more Gambians to take advantage of these coping mechanisms during the next pandemic. In the context of climate risks, improvements in physical infrastructure are necessary. Given the predictable occurrence of droughts, the country may want to invest in the development of an irrigation system that would make crop production less dependent on rainfall. In addition, the provision of basic utilities should be made resilient to climate events. Currently, the country's electricity supply is prone to system-wide blackouts when one part of the network is affected by a storm. In addition, key water sources in the greater Banjul area are prone to flooding and contamination. To prepare for the likely occurrence of severe climate events, the country should continue with its efforts to diversify and expand its electricity supply, as well as further its investment in its water supply infrastructure. Finally, the third tier of our strategy is about preparing for the unknown. Of course, it would be very convenient if we knew exactly where the next crisis would come from. For example, if we could predict with certainty that in a couple of years there would be a severe drought, it would make sense to make the development of an irrigation system a top priority. But if instead the next years bring about excessive rainfall, it might be better to prioritize the flood protection of key physical infrastructure. Unfortunately, there is a lot of uncertainty about where the next crisis will come from and how best to prepare for it. However, there are some things that the country can do to put itself in a better position, regardless of the precise nature of the next crisis. One thing that is common to virtually all crises is the need for government response. Depending on the exact details of the crisis, the government may need to step in to help repair damage to physical infrastructure, provide temporary assistance to the affected, or expand the provision of certain government services. This requires funding. A generic way to ensure against risks is to make sure that the government can access funding when it needs it. The Gambia entered the current crisis heavily indebted. This meant that it had no access to non-concessional loans. While development partners have stepped in to support the country's crisis response, such funding may be particularly scarce during global crises. Reducing its debt burden is the only sustainable way to transform the government from a source of risk to a source of resilience. This is perhaps the best way for the Gambia to put itself in a better position to face the next crisis, whatever it may be. At the same time, the government must improve its efficiency and expand its tax base. Currently, tax revenue is well below potential and could be increased by 4 to 6% of GDP. For example, phasing out discretionary tax exemptions is likely to increase tax revenue by 3% of GDP over the medium term. Next slide, please. Oh. If there is one message that we would like you to take away from this report, it is this. Look around you. Think about all of the ways in which you felt proud about how the Gambia rose to the occasion during the current crisis. And there is a lot to feel proud about. For example, it is commendable how the government, strapped for cash, was able to repurpose some of its budget towards crisis relief and response. It is also really remarkable that despite the global downturn, remittances rose as the diaspora rose to the occasion to help finance household necessities. Take stock of what worked well and think about how to preserve and expand it. But also look at where the Gambia fell short. Think of all the ways in which the country could have been better prepared to meet the challenges brought about the pandemic. Identify these vulnerabilities and start thinking about plans to address them. Implementing these plans may have to wait until more immediate needs are met. But it is good to take note and have plans in place for when the country is ready to start thinking about its next phase. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Maya, for that presentation. I will quickly hand it over to Bezat. He will take us through the quick Q&A session. Bezat, over to you.
Thank you very much, Hatija. So hello, everyone, again from my side. Thank you very much, Moritz and Maya, for the very timely presentation of two very important topics for the Gambia and economy and more broadly. So I'll start with the discussion. We have about 20 minutes for that. I'll begin with the questions in the chat. So first question goes to Moritz about labor market participation prospects. So the question says that a lot of this depends on human capital, which brings us back to the education system. First question is, do you agree with that? And the second question is, what exactly can be done in education that would have the strongest impact in the medium term?
Thank you very much, Besat, and thank you very much for this question. I think the first question is pretty easy to answer. I agree that human capital plays an important role in strengthening labor market outcomes and providing a sustainable path for poverty reduction. So how to achieve this objective? I do see that there are two dimensions to keep in mind. On the one hand, we do want to make sure that kids, boys and girls, go to school. And second, we need to make sure that they learn what is relevant for the future. On the first point, there are examples from countries around the world which could help us to improve these outcomes in the Gambia. I'm thinking about Latin America, Brazil, Mexico, where conditional cash transfers have played an important role in giving parents an incentive to send their kids to school, send their boys and girls to school and keep them in school, which guarantees that they learn for 4, 6, 10 years. Another example might be school feeding programs. We do see across the world that in many countries, parents send their kids to school because this is the place where they can eat. And food itself is an important part of building human capital, of making sure that they can also learn. As a last point, I do think that it is crucial, and COVID-19 has maybe taught us a lesson here, that kids stay in school. And in here, adaptive social protection programs do play an important role to make sure that families do not see the opportunity of taking kids out of school as their preferred mitigation mechanism for the crisis. Talking about quality of education, I do agree, or I do see that teachers training will play an important role, but also having incentive schemes for teachers to remain in school and then also teach school students when they come there is important. Absence and the quality of public services, especially in Africa and South Asia, a big challenge. And secondly, we do see, not only in terms of very basic skills, but also skills which are relevant for labor markets, that requirements are changing on a daily basis. It will be important to adjust school curricula to reflect these changes. As a last point, and I think that remains us, that learning does not end with the end of high school. We need to make sure that people learn as they enter their job through vocational training, but also on the job itself. Firm and sector-specific knowledge plays a tremendous role in explaining weight differentials between people. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Moritz, for that very insightful answer. So you discussed quite a bit about education, but also about informality and migration. So next question for you from the chat is, what can be done to improve job opportunities through formal migration, for example, through labor schemes in the medical and hospitality sectors?
Thank you very much, Besat, and thanks for this question. Migration is about accessing labor markets, accessing opportunities. And this holds true for domestic migration between rural and urban areas, but also international migration. In this context, it is important to facilitate access to opportunities. And I do think that the literature, academic literature, but also the policy discussion is more and more acknowledging the fact that there are benefits for both sending and receiving countries. I do see that migration, especially international migration in the Gambia, leads to brain drain. We are losing talents. We are losing maybe those who would be needed in the country to contribute to economic activity over there. But we also see that remittances do play an important role in financing, on the one hand, consumption, but also investments, a topic we have discussed earlier. I think the international discussion is moving towards the question on how to facilitate these kind of labor schemes. And we have seen successful examples of how this could work. I'm thinking about Asia. In here, and more specifically in the Philippines, this problem of brain drain has been turned around into brain gain, where we do see that especially in the health sector, men and women, mostly women who have migrated at early age, return as they retire in order to then set up their own clinics, set up health services in the Philippines itself. And I could imagine this to be also an opportunity for the Gambia. We have a lot of nurses who have left the country to go to Great Britain. we have a very similar situation to what happened in the Philippines, even though there are some structural differences in the economy. All this has ensured that on the one hand, access to international labor markets allows people to access opportunities which are important to raise incomes and reduce poverty, but at the same time also translate into a sustainable strategy on how the country can benefit from these as migrants return and as they might set up businesses, might set up new economic sectors like the health, tourism, which could create jobs and could raise incomes in the Gambia.
Thanks, Moritz. So very, very insightful, and migration is also a topic close to my own heart. So very glad to hear these views personally. But I think it's also very important for the Gambia overall. Before we continue with the labor market parts, let's switch a little bit to resilience. So Maya, the next question is for you. And this is from me. The report suggests both a variety of infrastructure projects and the need to reduce government debt to improve resilience. But how do you think the government can prioritize these two things? And furthermore, in general, so you mentioned a number of different things that has to be done, but how do you see the optimal mix, let's say, or how would you prioritize? Thanks.
Thank you very much for this question. So let me actually start with a quick disclaimer. So I worked with the World Bank on this report, but this is a complicated question. And so I want to sort of clarify that my views on this do not necessarily reflect the World Bank's views on this, but rather just my own. Looking at the Gambia situation, I think what would be obvious to all of us is that the most urgent need is meeting urgent needs, right? So this is an unprecedented pandemic. There's a lot going on with the here and now that needs to be addressed. And that should be the most immediate priority. So I think infrastructure projects and debt repayment, these are things that have to wait until after the country exits the crisis. However, in the medium term, I think that there's really a lot of uncertainty about what the next crisis will be. And I think that's part of why we chose to think about resilience more generally. And so if we take, for example, the example of climate change, which is clearly a big source of risk for the Gambia, both in terms of droughts and in terms of floods. If we look at the climate projections, we see that they reflect a lot of uncertainty. So it's both likely that climate change will decrease rainfall by 40% in the next 100 years, but it's almost as likely that it will increase rainfall by 40% over the 100 years. So when thinking about undertaking large infrastructure projects to address climate, it's not altogether clear which climate crisis needs to be addressed, right? Do we need to prepare for droughts or do we need to prepare for excessive rainfall? And I think that in light of this uncertainty, the best thing that the Gambia can do is just wait and prepare for the unknown. And by this, I mean, get its fiscal house in order. So repay government debt, wait and see until we have more accurate climate projections. And in the meantime, before investing massively in infrastructure projects, which might turn out to be just the wrong ones, it would make sense for the Gambia to get its fiscal house in order, repay debt, and put itself in a better position to face the next crisis, whatever it will be.
Thank you so much, Maya. That makes a lot of sense to me, at least. So let's go back to the education system, since that seems to be of a lot of interest here in the chat. So Moritz, the next question is as follows. So the education system of many countries is not teaching children or adolescents for the jobs of the future, many of which have still not even been created or are rapidly evolving as the world is changing in the 21st century, especially in STEM. So both of these will be relevant. And combined with that, another question from Professor Ka. How do you see leveraging our youth bulge by training more young people in areas needed to grow the Gambian economy, and also give youth pathways to work overseas if they would like to? Over to you, Moritz.
Thank you very much for these two additional questions on education and migration, which are fundamental linked to labor markets. As we think about education, I'd already highlighted the fact that it does not only matter how much we learn, but also what we learn. And in here, international best practice suggests that a solid foundation in terms of reading and writing will always be important. And these are the skills where we do see that boys and girls in the Gambia show deficits. Looking into the Human Capital Index, I had already highlighted that there are huge deficits, and investments in these very basic foundational skills will remain important independent of what the future brings. In addition to this, we do see that especially when it comes to STEM, but also to other skills which are relevant for jobs, for the future economy, there will remain a combination of formal learning in schools, in vocational schools, at universities, but also this experience on the job itself. I think moving forward, we need to ask questions in how far the education, the university system, but also the vocational system in the Gambia is able to communicate these skills. We need to make sure that we attract the right talents to get there. And in here, I do see large deficits along girls who across the world tend to not go into this field, often because of social norms. And we need to make sure that people continue learning as they enter the labor market. In here, formalization of the private sector of jobs, and also like the possibility of growing firms which trade internationally and exchange experience also contributes to human capital accumulation. Skills which will be then acquired on the job, but in combination with the formal skills do make a huge difference in terms of productivity, but then also later on in terms of earnings. Thinking about the youth, the Gambia is a young country with a high fertility rate. And as mentioned earlier, the number of Gambians entering the labor market is increasing on a yearly basis. At the moment, we are talking about 60,000 men and women who enter the labor force. I do think that there's a significant number of reforms which can unlock the potential of the Gambian economy to absorb these individuals. We talked earlier on about the important role of fiscal policy to build like a sound foundation, but also the important role of private sector-led growth. In here, the business environment will be crucial to attract further investments domestically and internationally to make sure that further jobs are created. And yes, I am talking about urban areas and the service sector where these jobs will be important, but I'm also thinking about rural areas where some investments in agriculture and extension services, but also the irrigation infrastructure do have a potential to increase the productivity of the agricultural sector and thereby attract young people. In fact, we do have a narrative in the Gambia where locals tell us that along many lines, there are missing hands during the harvest season. Young men, young women do not want to work in the agricultural sector and instead stay in urban areas, hoping for a better job. As a last point, I'd already talked about this challenge of international migration. The Gambia has always been a country of international migration, and I think there will be, as we move forward, not just on a policy level, but also in practical terms, space to think about transfer programs where people, where both receiving and sending countries can benefit. Work visa I've mentioned Asia early on, can play an important role in here, and make sure that migration moves away from being irregular, which often comes with a lot of pain and damage to society and households, to direct it towards regular migration, which opens opportunities. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Moritz. So we don't have any more questions from the chat. At this point, I'd like to ask, are there any other questions? If you would like to speak, also please raise your virtual hand on Zoom and we will give you the floor. Okay, so I don't see any hands raised and there aren't any other questions here in the chat. So I'd like to close the session. Thank you very much, everyone. And I see we've just received another quick question. So last question before we close. I think this is for Moritz. So only 12% of children of ages 7 to 14 have foundational reading skills, and 3.5% had foundational numeracy skills. Twice as many children in urban areas perform better in these skills, and the standards behind these skills are generally very low. This looks like a crisis in the making. So Moritz, quick impressions from your side on that comment.
I agree on this statement. I agree on this assessment. I think the Human Capital Index the World Bank is publishing making exactly this point. Behind each of these numbers, there is an individual which will likely not be able to escape poverty. I think we need to think about interventions, and I've mentioned some of them on how to close these gaps. Yet, and that's also important to consider in this discussion, it's not just about individuals, it's also about the country itself, the economy. Investments in education are investments, and they bring the country forward. If we miss out on closing some of these development gaps, let it be on education, let it be on health, let it be on malnutrition, we are risking the future of the country. And I do agree with Gordon, who has asked these questions, that urgent action is needed. And I do see that and on behalf of international development partners, but also the government, there has been attention to the sector, but further action is needed.
Thank you so much, Moritz. So I think we're out of questions and just about out of time. So thank you very much, both Moritz and Maya. I really enjoyed the discussion and the presentations. So Hatice, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Bezal. I saw that Maya raised her hand. I think she wants to come in quickly.
Yes, thank you. So if there's time, I just wanted to follow up and say that I think that investment in education is another excellent way to foster resilience. I mean, especially if we don't know what lies ahead and what types of shocks we're going to face, having an educated, resilient workforce that can use multi-purpose skills to transition between different types of jobs and think about creative solutions to problems that the country faces. I think that that's should be a first priority from the resilience aspect as well. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Maya, and sorry for not seeing your hand there. Very insightful. Thanks. Hatice?
Thank you, everyone. A big thanks to all the panelists and the presenters, Moritz, Maya. That was very, very good. And the questions also were very good and very critical. And we thank everyone who took part in this discussion. Quickly, before we close today's session, I will just hand it over to the PS Dialog to give us a closing remark. Yes.
Thank you very much, Khadija, the World Bank Resident Web, for organizing this important economic update launching. And I also want to register my appreciation to my fellow panelists and all the other, including yourself, Adija, and all the other people who have been invited and have participated in this this launching. I want to, I'm in agreement with some of the panelists that have stated that human capital development is the most important because it makes a country very, very resilient. So investments in human capital should be one of our priority objectives as far as developing countries are concerned. In the Gambia also, if you are familiar with the economic trends, or since independence, the Gambia has experienced about 11 droughts. And in most cases, in all instances that we had experienced droughts, we also observe that we register negative economic growth. So maintaining resilience within agriculture is also fundamental because otherwise the per capita growth rate will be severely undermined. And if you look at within agriculture, our because of the lack of investments in infrastructure and diversity in terms of diversity in terms of the products and services offered by that sector, it makes our economy also very, very vulnerable. On this note, I would want to use this opportunity to say thank you to all of you for attending this important economic update launching. Thank you.
Thank you, P.S. Jallo, for those kind words. I will invite Lydia to deliver a vote of thanks, and we'll close the session for today. Thank you all.
Thank you very much, Hadija. I hope you can hear me.
Yes, Lydia, we can hear you.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon, Honorable Minister of Finance and Economic Affairs, permanent secretaries, representatives from different ministries, departments and agencies, representatives from the public and private sector, academias, development partners, civil society representatives, the media and colleagues. It's my privilege to provide a vote of thanks on this occasion. On behalf of the World Bank and the entire team, I would like to extend a very hearty vote of thanks to all of you who participated in this virtual launch of the Gambia Economic Update. I would also like to take this opportunity to extend a special thanks to Mawish and the team who produced this great piece of analytical work and shared the findings with us today. It took a lot of work and dedication from the team to finalize this economic update and organize this successful launching event. Everyone who have been involved in this have our appreciation for the enormous collaboration and participation. We have gained a lot of useful insights on the Gambia economy that will help us to think strategically and make decisions to optimize the outcome and prepare ourselves to address challenges moving forward. Honorable Minister, ladies and gentlemen, once again, I want to state that we are all most grateful to all the speakers, presenters, panel members, and moderators on this virtual stage. We thank participants for being with us and for their active participation and insightful discussion. It has been a great pleasure. Finally, I would again like to thank the Honorable Minister for taking the time to be with us during this important event and for providing us all the necessary support, making this event a success. Once again, from the World Bank, thank you. With that, we close the event and wish everyone a very good evening. Thank you.